Like every other Sunday, the family Willis would visit their beloved James, who passed away a few years earlier. James, the husband of Jane and father of Rick and Max, died due to a heart condition and has been a big miss. However, today they saw a wolf standing over James's grave, and it refused to move. Not sure what to do, they called the police, who decided to check the cameras to get to know where it came from. While doing so, they discovered something shocking, making Jane sink to her knees. Refused to believe what she saw. Jane couldn't believe what she saw. She wasn't ready for this, and at first questioned everything she saw on that footage. But the police assured her that they were real images and that Jane had to face up to the facts. No matter how shocking the images of the security camera were, Jane and the officers had no choice but to check them. It was their only way of learning the truth, and it didn't take them long to see the disturbing truth behind this absurd scenery. The police hesitantly informed Jane about the fact that they had to dig up the grave. They told her it was even more dangerous to leave the grave as it was, so Jane had no choice but to agree. But why was there a wolf on the grave, refusing to leave? Why was Jane so terribly disturbed by the camera footage? And why did they have no choice but to dig up the grave? James's death was a tragic death because he seemed so healthy, and so it always raised questions among the next of kin. James was a man of many acquaintances. Jane barely knew these acquaintances, seeing many of them for the first time only at the funeral. Although she always remained curious, it only surfaced on this fateful day. As a family, they had a tradition. Every Sunday, right after they had been to church, they visited James's grave. The one time, they brought flowers. The other time, they quickly took a broom over the grave and left early on. Rick and Max, who sometimes went along somewhat against their will, noticed something this time. It was the Sunday before the tragic wolf incident. Rick walked ahead and arrived at the cemetery before his mother and younger brother. And as he approached his father's grave, he noticed traces of mud alongside some other remarkable things. Because he also clearly sees footprints in the mud tracks, Rick has a strange feeling about it and immediately informs his mother. She doesn't think much of it. She says it probably belongs to one of the cemetery employees, then asks Rick to put flowers on the grave. He decides to leave, since he can't find anything or anyone. A day later, the school week starts, and Rick completely forgets his premonition from that Sunday. He is way too busy with school and doesn't follow through on his plan to go back to the cemetery. Had he done so, he would have prevented a lot of misery. It is Sunday. Jane, Rick, and Max walk out of the church ready to go to the cemetery. Jane is extra excited today without any immediate reason. She suggests having lunch nearby before they go. How things could have turned out differently if she hadn't suggested this. The family enjoys their lunch before going to the grave. This time they walk next to each other while the cemetery is already in sight. And then there is that terrible image. An emaciated wolf stands on James's grave. Jane and Max freeze completely while Rick slowly approaches, but the wolf notices Rick. He shows his teeth, and Rick understands that he has to keep his distance. Filled with fear, he slowly walks back to his mother and little brother to ask what they should do. By that time, Jane already calls 911 in a panic. Jane has to repeat her story several times because she is simply not believed. They ask if she's been drinking, while she's desperately emphasizing that she understands it sounds bizarre, but it's actually true. Then she finally gets the help she asks for. A police car is immediately sent her way. The police arrive shortly after and are met at the gate by Jane. They are very skeptical and first ask her if she didn't just see a dog instead of a wolf. But Jane persists. and rightly so. Jane escorts the agents to the grave, where Rick and Max keep an eye on the wolf from a safe distance. The wolf is still not gone and keeps sniffing the grave. Then the agents finally see that Jane has not lied. Their response said it all. They're scared to death. They had underestimated it, and now that they saw the wild wolf, they didn't know what to do. They did the only thing they were authorized to do. They sealed off the cemetery and called animal specialists. Shortly afterwards, they went looking for the camera footage. This whole scene was really starting to take a turn now. Jane sees how the police are busy cordoning off everything. She stays close to make sure that she's informed as soon as they know more. One of the officers approaches her to ask if there is anything he can do for her. She replies that she would also like to see the footage. The agent has bad news for her. He tells her that she may eventually be allowed to see the footage, but that initially, only the police are allowed to view the images. Jane is frustrated and disagrees, but the agent keeps saying it has to do with privacy laws. Jane is stunned, meanwhile taking a look at the wolf. The wolf is still not off the grave. Jane couldn't believe it. What could be there? Why didn't the wolf respond to the humans? And why did it seem so determined? Jane realizes she must find out what's going on here, as her husband would have wanted. She then takes a risk. She follows the agents to the office at the cemetery. She thought that the officers would look at the camera images there. At least, they would get closer to the truth. And Jane felt she deserved it too. She was on to something. Jane then sees the officers watching the footage on a large screen. They seem to watch the nighttime images first, while Jane secretly watches from outside. It is difficult for Jane to see exactly what is happening in the images. But then, there is clearly something to see. It is a clear figure that leaves something on the grave, presumably a man who has dressed unrecognizably. He behaves mysteriously in the images, and it seems that he has been at the grave on several occasions. Unfortunately, that wasn't all. The last image clearly shows the man taking out a small shovel and starting to dig in the grave. Jane sees him plant something in it and loses her cool. She collapses on her legs as she sees someone take away her late husband's honor. She storms in, and the cops look up in surprise. They initially want to send her away, although they understand her emotion. Then the leading officer intervenes and has an idea to solve this. Jane waits in suspense. They decide to dig up the grave to make sure this doesn't happen again. They discover a certain resource in the tomb. The man in the footage turned out to be an old rival of James, who wanted to dishonor him by fouling his grave with a resource that attracts wild animals. The wolf is returned to the wild, and the man is arrested.